The room was very quiet, save for the steady beeping of the monitor. My heart raced as I stood by his side, watching the rise and fall of his chest, so faint as if life was slipping away. My husband, once full of life, now lay still on the hospital bed, caught between life and death. We had come so far together, but was this the end? I didn't know if I could handle the truth that awaited me when the doctors came in. Would he ever wake up again, or had I already lost him? My name is Sarah Turner, a 38-year-old mother of two and a dedicated homemaker. My husband, Mark Turner, turned 40 just last month. We've been married for 15 years, sharing a life that I once believed was as solid as the home we built together. Mark is a tall, broad-shouldered man with thick, dark hair that's just starting to show signs of silver around his temples. His brown eyes, which once sparkled with excitement and love for life, have dimmed over the past few years, reflecting something that I could never quite place. I remember feeling butterflies in my stomach as we talked that night, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about his dreams of traveling the world and owning his own business. He made me feel like anything was possible, like we were invincible together. From that night on, we were inseparable. Our relationship moved fast, but it felt right. Within a year, we were married, standing under a canopy of twinkling lights in my parents' backyard, promising to love and cherish each other forever. The first few years of our marriage were nothing short of magical. We traveled whenever we could, small weekend getaways to the beach, road trips through the mountains, and even a few big trips overseas. Mark was always the adventurous one, convincing me to try things I never thought I would. We hiked, we surfed, we explored new cities, and we dreamed about our future together. Life was full of excitement, and I was blissfully happy. We settled into a comfortable life in a small but cozy house in the suburbs. Mark found success in his job, working his way up in a corporate firm while I pursued a career in teaching, a job I loved. Everything seemed perfect. We worked hard, but we always found time for each other. Dinners out, lazy Sunday mornings, and spontaneous dates were our norm. We talked about everything, our dreams, our goals, and eventually, starting a family. When I was 28, our daughter Anna was born, and she became the center of our world. Mark was thrilled to be a father, and I loved watching him with her. He was the kind of dad who would get down on the floor to play, who would take her to the park, who would be up in the middle of the night rocking her back to sleep. 2 years later, our son Jack was born, and our family felt complete. Our days were busy and chaotic, filled with diaper changes, sleepless nights, and balancing work and parenting, but we were happy. At least, that's what I told myself. As the years passed, something began to change between us. It was subtle at first, small things that I brushed off as normal parts of a long-term relationship. Mark started working longer hours, often coming home late, too tired to talk or spend time with me. Our once passionate and spontaneous relationship became routine. We still loved each other, but the spark we once had seemed to be fading. I thought it was just a phase, that every couple goes through periods like this, especially with 2 young kids and the demands of work. But then the distance between us grew more noticeable. Mark became more withdrawn, spending long hours at work or on his phone. He was always texting or checking emails, even during family dinners. Our conversations became short and shallow. Gone were the late-night talks we used to have about our dreams and the future. Instead, we talked about mundane things: bills, schedules, the kids. I missed him, the way we used to laugh together, the way we used to feel like partners in everything. I tried to talk to him about it a few times, but he always brushed it off, saying he was just stressed from work. His business, which he had finally started after years of dreaming about it, was taking off, but with that success came more responsibilities. I understood that. I tried to be supportive, giving him space to focus on his work, but deep down, I was starting to feel lonely. Mark's business was his baby. He had left his stable corporate job 5 years ago to start his own marketing firm, a risky move that I fully supported, even though it meant tightening our belts financially for a while. He was passionate about it, working long hours to build his client base, attending endless networking events, and traveling frequently for meetings. At first, I admired his dedication. I knew how much this meant to him, and I wanted him to succeed. But as the business grew, so did the distance between us. Mark's long hours at the office turned into late nights, and those late nights turned into weekends away for work trips. He was always on his phone, even when he was home. I'd catch him texting or emailing during dinner or while we were watching TV, and when I asked him about it, he'd say it was just a client or something urgent at work. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Mark had never given me a reason to doubt him before. Our love life suffered too. Intimacy, once a natural part of our relationship, became rare. It was like we were living parallel lives, coexisting in the same house, but not really connecting. I started to wonder if this was just what happens after years of marriage, if maybe we had grown too comfortable with each other. But there were moments, late at night when I was lying awake in bed next to him, that I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, after the kids were in bed, I tried to talk to him about it again. I told him I missed him, that I felt like we were drifting apart. He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "It's just work, Sarah. Things are crazy right now, but it'll get better. I promise." I wanted to believe him, but there was something in his tone that didn't sit right with me. He wasn't the same Mark I fell in love with, and I didn't know how to bring him back. As the months passed, things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. Mark became even more distant, often coming home late and going straight to his office to finish up some work. He'd be on his laptop until the early hours of the morning, and when I'd ask him about it, he'd just say that running a business took time. He was always on his phone, always busy, always distracted. There were nights when he wouldn't come home at all, claiming he had to stay at the office to meet a deadline. I wanted to believe him, but the doubt that had been creeping in for months was becoming impossible to ignore. I'd hear the kids ask, "Where's Daddy?" and I'd tell them he was working late, but the truth was, I didn't know where he was half the time. I confided in my best friend, Emily, one afternoon over coffee. Emily and I had been friends since college, and she knew Mark well. She was there when we first started dating, and she had been by my side through every milestone in our marriage. "Do you think he's cheating?" she asked bluntly, and the question hit me like a punch in the gut. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. The thought had crossed my mind, of course, but I had pushed it away, not wanting to believe that Mark would ever betray me like that. We had been through so much together, built a life, a family. How could he? "You need to find out," Emily said, her voice firm. "You can't just ignore this, Sarah. You deserve to know the truth." That night, after Mark had gone to bed, I sat in the living room with my thoughts racing. Could he really be cheating? Was that why he had been so distant? My heart ached at the possibility, but I knew Emily was right. I couldn't just bury my head in the sand. I needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Over the next few days, I started paying more attention to Mark's behavior. I watched as he'd sneak off to take phone calls in the other room, how he'd get defensive when I asked him who he was talking to. I noticed how he'd suddenly get a text and rush out the door, claiming he had forgotten something at the office. The signs were all there, but I still didn't want to believe it. Then, one evening, Mark came home late again. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "Work," he replied, but his tone was off, too casual, too rehearsed. "Work?" I repeated, standing up and crossing my arms. "Mark, it's almost midnight. I told you, Sarah. Things are crazy right now," he said, clearly annoyed. "I don't have time for this." And that was it. The moment I knew something was seriously wrong. His defensiveness, the way he dismissed my concerns, the way he refused to look me in the eye, it all added up. I felt my stomach drop, and my heart raced as I realized that the man I had loved for so long, the man I had built my life with, might be hiding something from me. That night, after Mark fell asleep, I made a decision. I was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. The night I decided to uncover the truth about Mark was one of the longest nights of my life. Lying next to him in bed, I could feel the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. His breathing was steady and deep, and I wondered how he could sleep so soundly while I was drowning in doubt. I turned over, watching the glow of his phone on the nightstand, and the thought of what I might find if I looked through it gnawed at me. But I wasn't ready to invade his privacy, not yet. Instead, I lay awake for hours, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Was it all in my head? Had I been overreacting? Or was there really something going on that he didn't want me to know about? The next morning, after Mark left for work, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in my hands, staring out the window. The kids were already at school, and the house was eerily quiet. My thoughts swirled like a storm, crashing into each other, making it impossible to focus on anything else. I needed to figure out what was going on, but I didn't know where to start. That's when I remembered Emily's words, "You deserve to know the truth." With a deep breath, I decided that the only way to find out was to confront the situation head-on. But instead of directly asking Mark, I knew I had to be more careful. If he was hiding something, I couldn't risk him covering his tracks. I needed to gather my own evidence before making any accusations. I began by paying closer attention to the details. Over the next few days, I noticed that Mark's behavior became even more suspicious. He'd come home late, sometimes not at all, claiming he was working late at the office, but his excuses started to sound rehearsed, as though he was using the same script each time. He'd avoid my questions or change the subject whenever I brought up how distant he seemed. One evening, I decided to test him. When he told me he had to stay late at work again, I casually asked, "Can I come by and bring you some dinner? You must be exhausted." He hesitated, just for a second, but it was long enough for me to notice. "No, that's okay," he said, smiling weakly. "I'll probably be in a meeting most of the night. Don't worry about me." I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, the pit in my stomach grew heavier. His response only confirmed what I had been dreading. Something wasn't right. A few nights later, after Mark had gone to bed, I finally gathered the courage to check his phone. My hands shook as I unlocked the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself that I was only doing this because I needed answers, but deep down, I knew I was afraid of what I might find. I scrolled through his messages, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. At first, everything seemed normal, texts from work colleagues, the occasional message from his family. But then I saw it. A message from someone named Jess. My heart raced as I opened the conversation, my fingers trembling. The messages were casual at first, nothing overtly suspicious, but as I scrolled further up, the tone of the conversation changed. There were late-night messages, inside jokes, and photos of them together, smiling, laughing, in places I didn't recognize. The timestamps lined up with the nights Mark had told me he was working late. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. Jess wasn't just a colleague. She was someone Mark had been spending time with, someone who wasn't me. I put the phone down, my mind spinning. I didn't know what to do, what to think. The man I had loved for over a decade, the father of my children, was lying to me. He was betraying me. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to confront Mark right away. I needed more information. I needed to know how deep this betrayal went. So, I decided to keep watching, keep gathering evidence. In the following weeks, I became a detective in my own marriage. I would check his phone whenever he left it unattended, take note of his schedule, and even drive by his office when he said he was working late. Each time, my suspicions were confirmed. Mark was lying to me. He wasn't at the office on those late nights. He was with her. One evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat in the living room, staring at the photos of Mark and Jess on my phone. There was one in particular that broke my heart, a picture of them at a fancy restaurant, laughing together, her hand on his arm. It was a place Mark and I used to go to, back when we were still happy, before everything started falling apart. I felt sick to my stomach. How could he do this to me? How could he throw away everything we had built together? I thought about our children, about the life we had created, and I couldn't understand how he could be so reckless, so selfish. That night, as Mark slept soundly beside me, I cried silently into my pillow. I wanted to scream, to shake him awake and demand answers, but I knew I couldn't do that, not yet. I wasn't ready for the confrontation, and I wasn't ready to face the reality of what his betrayal meant for our family. In the weeks that followed, I continued to gather evidence. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, watching my life fall apart in slow motion. I tried to keep up appearances for the kids' sake, pretending everything was fine, but inside, I was a mess. I didn't know how much longer I could keep up the charade. Then, one day, I found the final piece of evidence that shattered any hope I had left. Mark had been careless. He left his work laptop open on the kitchen counter while he was getting ready for a meeting. As I passed by, I glanced at the screen and saw an email thread between him and Jess. They were planning a weekend getaway, just the two of them. I couldn't breathe. The words blurred together on the screen as I realized the extent of his betrayal. It wasn't just a fling, something he could brush off as a mistake. This was planned. This was deliberate. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. All those nights he had told me he was working late, all those times I had believed him, he had been with her. He had lied to me, over and over again, without a second thought. The worst part was that he had no idea I knew. He continued to go about his day as if nothing was wrong, as if our marriage was still intact. But I knew the truth now, and there was no going back. That evening, I sat on the edge of our bed, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I had discovered. Mark came into the room, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. He smiled at me, the same smile he had given me for years, but now it felt hollow, fake. "I'm going to be late again tomorrow," he said casually, pulling off his tie. "Big client meeting." I nodded, biting back the anger rising in my throat. I wanted to scream at him, to throw the evidence in his face and demand to know how he could betray me like this. But instead, I said nothing. I waited until he was asleep, then slipped out of bed and went to the living room. I paced back and forth, my mind racing. What was I going to do? I couldn't keep living like this, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I deserved better than this. My children deserved better. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Mark yet, but I was going to make sure that when I did, I had everything I needed. I started documenting everything, the texts, the emails, the photos. I printed them out, saved them on a USB drive, and even emailed them to myself, just in case. I wasn't going to let him gaslight me or deny what he had done. When the time came, I would be ready. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. Every time I looked at Mark, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. How could he lie to my face every day? How could he act like everything was normal when he was tearing our family apart? I didn't want to believe that this was happening to me. I had always thought we were the exception, the couple that would make it through anything. But now, I realized that I had been living in a fantasy. The man I thought I knew, the man I had built a life with, was a stranger to me now. One evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, Anna looked up at me with her big brown eyes and asked, "Mommy, why is Daddy always at work? Doesn't he want to spend time with us anymore?" Her words hit me like a freight train. I felt the tears welling up in my eyes, but I forced a smile and kissed her forehead. "Daddy loves you very much, sweetheart," I said, my voice shaking. "He's just very busy right now." But inside, I was breaking. How could I explain to my children what was really going on? How could I tell them that their father was betraying us all? They deserved to grow up in a happy home, not one built on lies and deceit. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat in the living room with a glass of wine, staring at the pile of evidence I had gathered over the past few weeks. My hands shook as I flipped through the photos, the text messages, the emails. This was my life now, a series of lies and betrayals, all laid out in front of me. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. The facade I had been holding onto was crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I had to confront Mark. I had to know why he had done this to us. But I also knew that I had to be smart about it. I couldn't just explode in anger as much as I wanted to. I needed to think about the kids, about what this would mean for them. I needed to plan my next move carefully, to make sure that I came out of this with my dignity intact, for their sake. The following morning, Mark left for work, again, giving me the same rehearsed excuse about meetings and deadlines. I watched him drive away, my stomach churning with anxiety and anger. But this time, I didn't stay home, pretending everything was fine. This time, I followed him. I waited until he was a few blocks ahead before getting in my car and trailing behind. I kept my distance, making sure he wouldn't see me. My heart raced as I followed him through the streets, unsure of what I was about to uncover. I already knew he was lying, but seeing it with my own eyes felt different, more real, more painful. After about 20 minutes of driving, Mark pulled into a parking lot outside a small, upscale hotel. I watched from a distance as he got out of the car and walked inside. My stomach dropped. I knew what this meant, but I still wasn't prepared for the reality of it. I parked my car and sat there for a few moments, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to storm in there, to confront him and Jess right then and there. But another part of me, the part that had been trying to hold everything together, stopped me. I wasn't ready for that yet. I needed more time to process everything. So instead, I sat in the car, watching the entrance to the hotel, my mind racing. How had we gotten here? How had my life, my marriage, fallen apart like this? I thought about our wedding day, about the promises we had made to each other, about the life we had built. And now it was all gone. When Mark finally emerged from the hotel hours later, he looked relaxed, carefree, like a man without a care in the world. He had no idea that I was sitting there, watching him, knowing the truth. As he drove away, I felt a sense of resolve settle over me. It was time. I couldn't hide from the truth anymore. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. The man I had loved for so long had betrayed me, and now I had to confront him. But I wasn't going to do it on his terms. No, I was going to make sure that when I confronted him, I had the upper hand. I wasn't going to let him lie his way out of this or make me feel like I was crazy. I had the evidence. I had the truth. And soon, Mark would have to face the consequences of his actions. The day I decided to confront Mark was unlike any other day. The tension in the air was palpable, and though he didn't know it yet, this was the day everything would change. I had spent weeks preparing, gathering every piece of evidence I could find, rehearsing what I would say in my head over and over again. I wasn't going to explode in anger or fall apart in tears. I was going to handle this with the cold, calculated precision of someone who had been wronged and was determined to reclaim their life. But it wasn't just about confronting Mark. No, that would be too easy. Simply yelling at him, telling him I knew about Jess, and demanding answers would leave me feeling empty. I needed more than that. I needed him to feel the same betrayal, the same pain that I had been carrying with me for months. I needed to make him pay for what he had done, not just to me, but to our children, to our family. That morning, I made sure everything was in place. I had already transferred half of our savings into an account he didn't know about, my safety net, just in case things got ugly. I had consulted with a lawyer, ensuring that I knew exactly what my rights were, and I had already started setting things up for a custody battle, should it come to that. I wasn't going to let Mark take the kids away from me. He had already taken so much, he wasn't going to take them too. I started by sending him a message, calm and nonchalant. Hey, can we talk tonight? I'd like to discuss a few things. He responded quickly, as I expected. Sure. Everything okay? Yeah, just want to go over some stuff. I knew he wouldn't suspect anything. I had played my role too well for too long, pretending that I was oblivious to the lies, pretending that I hadn't noticed the distance between us. But tonight, I was done pretending. Once I had sent the message, I went into action. I packed a small bag with essentials, clothes for me and the kids, some important documents, and my USB drive with all the evidence I had gathered. I wasn't sure how the night would end, but I was prepared for anything. My lawyer had assured me that I could leave with the kids if necessary, and I had already rented a small apartment in town where we could stay for a while. Mark didn't know about any of it. Next, I pulled out my phone and made a call to Jess. Yes, I had her number. I had found it weeks ago in one of the email threads she and Mark had exchanged, and though I had been tempted to call her before, I had held off. Until now. Hello? Her voice was soft, unsure. Hi, Jess. This is Sarah, Mark's wife. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear her heart stop. She hadn't expected this. Good. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. Oh, I think you do, I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. You've been seeing my husband for quite some time now. I just thought it was about time we had a little chat. I didn't, she was fumbling, trying to come up with an excuse, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. Save it, I interrupted. I don't care what you have to say. What I care about is making sure that my husband understands just how badly he screwed up. And you're going to help me with that. Help you? Why would I? Because if you don't, I will make sure that everyone you work with knows exactly who you are and what you've been doing, I said, my voice cold. I have every email, every text message, every photo, and I'm not afraid to use them. There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head. She knew I wasn't bluffing. "What do you want me to do?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. I smiled to myself. "Meet me at Mark's office tonight. We're going to surprise him together." Jess agreed, reluctantly, and I hung up the phone, feeling a surge of satisfaction. Step 1 of my plan was complete. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions, picking up the kids from school, helping them with their homework, and pretending that everything was normal. But inside, I was buzzing with anticipation. Tonight was the night I would finally take control. As the evening approached, I put the kids to bed early, telling them that Mommy and Daddy had some things to talk about. They didn't question it. They were used to Mark being gone at night, and they trusted me implicitly. I kissed them both goodnight, lingering a little longer with Anna, who looked up at me with those big brown eyes that were so much like Mark's. "Everything okay, Mommy?" she asked, her voice soft and concerned. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "Go to sleep. I'll see you in the morning." Once the kids were asleep, I grabbed my bag and headed out the door. My heart raced as I drove to Mark's office, the plan I had so carefully constructed playing over and over in my mind. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop me. When I arrived at Mark's office building, Jess was already there, waiting nervously by the entrance. She looked different than I had imagined, more plain, more vulnerable. She wasn't the glamorous, seductive woman I had built up in my head. She was just ordinary. It made me wonder what Mark saw in her, but I quickly pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. None of that mattered anymore. "Are you ready?" I asked her, my voice steady. She nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes. Good. She should be afraid. Together, we walked into the building and took the elevator up to Mark's floor. I had been here before, of course, back when things were good between us, back when I had supported his dream of building his own business. The memories of those times felt distant now, like they belonged to someone else. When we reached Mark's office, I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. There was a pause, and then I heard his voice from inside. "Come in." I opened the door slowly, stepping inside with Jess right behind me. Mark was sitting at his desk, looking up in surprise when he saw me. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stepped aside, allowing Jess to walk into the room. Mark's face went pale as he realized what was happening. "Jess? What is this?" I crossed my arms and looked him straight in the eye. "This, Mark, is the moment you finally face the consequences of your actions." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was caught, and he knew it. There was no way out of this now. "I know everything," I said, my voice cold and steady. "The late nights, the lies, the trips. I know about all of it, and I have the evidence to prove it." Mark's face twisted with panic. "Sarah, please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," I snapped. "You've been cheating on me for months. You betrayed me, betrayed our family. And now, you're going to pay for it." He stood up from his desk, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I never meant for this to happen, okay? I made a mistake. But it doesn't mean anything. I love you, Sarah. Stop lying." I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. "You don't love me. You haven't loved me in a long time. You think I'm just going to stand here and let you keep lying to me, to our kids?" Mark's eyes darted to Jess, who stood there silently, her arms crossed over her chest. "Jess, Don't talk to her," I interrupted. "She's not the one you should be worried about right now." Mark looked back at me, desperation in his eyes. "What do you want me to say, Sarah?" "I'm sorry. I messed up, okay? But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can." I laughed bitterly. "Counseling? You think that's going to fix this? You think a few therapy sessions are going to erase months of lies, of cheating?" He didn't respond. He knew there was no fixing this, no coming back from what he had done. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said, my voice cold and emotionless. "I've filed for divorce. And I'm taking the kids." Mark's face fell, and for a moment I saw the fear in his eyes, the realization that he was losing everything. "You can't do that," he said, his voice trembling. "You can't just take them away from me." "I can," I replied. "And I will. I turned to Jess, who had been standing silently in the corner, watching the scene unfold. I hope you're ready to deal with the mess you've made, because once this is over, you're all he's going to have left. Jess looked down at the floor, her face pale. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to be dragged into the mess of our broken marriage, and now that she didn't know how to handle it. I turned back to Mark, my voice softening just a little. You could have had everything, Mark. A loving wife, a beautiful family. But you threw it all away. For what? For her. I gestured toward Jess, who still refused to meet my gaze. Mark didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me, his expression one of defeat. I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction wash over me. For the first time in months, I was the one in control. I had taken back the power that Mark had stolen from me, and it felt damn good. I'm leaving now, I said, turning toward the door. I'll be in touch with my lawyer. Don't bother trying to contact me directly. As I walked out of his office, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The man I had loved, the man I had built my life with, was gone. But I wasn't sad. I wasn't heartbroken. I was free. That night, I moved into the apartment I had rented, taking the kids with me. I didn't tell them everything, not yet. I wanted to protect them from the ugliness of what was happening, at least for a little while. But they knew something had changed, and I promised them that everything would be okay. In the weeks that followed, Mark tried to reach out to me, tried to apologize, tried to make things right. But I wasn't interested. I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to let him back into my life. I had spent too long living in the shadow of his lies, and now it was time for me to start over. The divorce was finalized quickly, thanks to the evidence I had gathered. Mark didn't fight me on custody. He knew he didn't stand a chance. He had lost everything, and it was all his fault. As for Jess, I never saw or heard from her again. I didn't care what happened to her. She was just a blip on the radar, a symptom of the real problem. The real betrayal had come from Mark, and he was the one who had to live with the consequences. In the end, I got what I wanted. I got my freedom, my children, and the satisfaction of knowing that Mark would never be able to hurt me again. The life we had once shared was gone, but in its place, I found something new, strength, independence, and the knowledge that I was stronger than I had ever realized. The months after the divorce were a blur of legal meetings, custody arrangements, and trying to rebuild a life I hadn't expected to fall apart. I poured everything into the kids, making sure they felt loved and safe, but inside, I was still grappling with the emptiness Mark's betrayal had left behind. I thought that once everything was over, I'd feel a sense of relief, of closure. But it wasn't that simple. One evening, as I sat alone in my small apartment, sipping a glass of wine and staring out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. I had gotten my revenge, I had taken control, but instead of the satisfaction I had hoped for, there was only a gnawing emptiness. Mark had called a few times, wanting to talk, to explain himself, but I had ignored him. What was the point? I already knew the truth, and hearing more lies wouldn't change anything. Yet, part of me still wondered, what if? What if there was more to the story? What if I hadn't really understood everything? A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I hesitated before answering, my heart pounding as I opened it to find Mark standing there, looking older, worn down. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft, almost pleading. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to talk to you. Please." I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to say. The anger I had once felt was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but there was something else now, something I couldn't quite name. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," he admitted. I miss the kids. I miss us. I know it's too late, but I couldn't leave things like this. Not without at least trying to make you understand." I wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him to leave. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. The tension between us was thick, and the uncertainty of what came next loomed large in the room. "I don't know if we can ever fix this," I finally said, my voice trembling. "I don't even know if I want to." Mark looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't either. But I had to try." And as I sat there, staring at the man I had once loved, I realized I didn't have the answers. I didn't know if there was a future for us or if this was truly the end. All I knew was that the uncertainty of what came next would always haunt me.